Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Abnormal Psychology. Today's lecture, we're going to be exploring a little bit of the limbic system and emotions and dive into that fascinating world of the brain's biology because it really does play a crucial role in shaping our emotional experiences. So, today we're going to cover the biological components of what is called the limbic system and also some basic emotions. And we're going to dive into a number of things. We're going to dive into, first off, a little bit of the historical researchers and their legacy in the limbic system. We're also going to dive into an overview of the limbic system as well as some of the key components like the amygdala, the raphe nucleus, different neurotransmitters, the role of these different neurotransmitters, as well as a little bit of the biology of anxiety and shame and disgust. So let's dive into, maybe we'll do a little bit of a self-assessment here before we begin. So maybe just grab a piece of paper or something where you can do a little bit of recording, and I just want you to record your agreement to certain statements. And, if you agree, if it's yes, it's true for you, just give yourself a check mark or a point, and we'll just count up our points at the end. So the first statement: I often feel tense or on edge, even when there is no clear reason. Second one: I frequently worry about things that are outside of my control. Third one: I have difficulty sleeping because I can't stop thinking about various concerns. Fourth one: I find it hard to relax even in a comfortable environment. Fifth one: I sometimes feel my heart racing or experience shortness of breath without any exertion. Sixth one: I frequently feel overwhelmed by small tasks or responsibilities. Seventh one: I avoid situations or activities because they make me feel anxious. Next one: I often feel muscle tension, headaches, or other physical discomforts when stressed. Next one: I struggle to concentrate because my mind is preoccupied with worries. And the last one: I feel a sense of dread or impending doom about the future. Now, add those up and count up your score. And what we're going to do is just give you a little bit of a heads up about probably where your anxiety level is. So if you have 2 or less, then you probably have very minimal symptoms of anxiety. If you have 3 to 5, then you're probably in that mild category. 6 to 8 would be moderate anxiety. You experience some kind of significant anxiety that can affect different parts of your life, but it'd probably be helpful to find some coping strategies. But if you have 9 or more, then you probably experience some very high anxiety, and it tends to be pervasive and intense in your life. And so it might be important to kind of look into that and what you might be able to do to kind of reduce that anxiety a little bit. And so this lecture will certainly be of high importance to you. Now, want to introduce you to an influential researcher that's really kind of contributed quite a bit to our understanding of the biological basis of emotions. Jacques Panksepp, who was a fairly renowned neuroscientist and psychobiologist. Unfortunately, he died in 2017, but he has left a legacy in the field of affective neuroscience, which is the study of the affect, which is your emotions. And it really his work really kind of focused on the neural mechanisms underlying emotions. And so he did some groundbreaking research that really paved the way for a deeper understanding of the biological foundations of emotional experiences. So, one of Panksepp's works that he's best known for is his work in identifying basic emotions, those emotions that are hardwired into animals as well as humans. And he identified a number of primary emotional systems. One is seeking, the seeking system, which you can kind of think of as our exploration and curiosity system. But there's also the rage system, which involves anger and aggression. This is something we don't need to learn, we're born with. There's the fear system, the anxiety and avoidance system, and the play system, the social and joyful interaction system. And Panksepp conducted some fairly extensive research on animal models, particularly rats, and was looking at the neural circuits and behaviors associated with these different emotions. And so he helped us to bridge the gap between animal and human emotional experiences and really kind of shed some light on the common neurobiological substrates. So really what he identified was that there are some important specific brain circuits that regulate emotional states. And he really wanted to highlight the role of these subcortical structures. And there are some important ones, such as the amygdala and what we call the limbic system. And limbus just means edge. So it's kind of, there's these spaces deep inside your brain that are kind of the edges of different systems. And those edges end up being where our emotions reside. So we call that the limbic system. And he showed through this research and that there is some really important neurobiology of emotions that contributes to the development of very novel emotional experiences. And so we need some very novel therapeutic approaches for dealing with things like emotional dysregulation and mood disorders. Now, what I want to do is take just a little bit of time in our lecture to explore the biological components of the limbic system. And as I've already mentioned, the term limbic it means a border or an edge. It's the Latin term limbus. And in the context of neuroscience, limbic refers to the location of the limbic system, which forms an edge or boundary between the older, more primitive parts of the brain, such as the brain stem, and the newer, more advanced regions, such as our conscious area, our cerebral cortex. So this positioning really highlights its pivotal role in bridging emotional and cognitive processes. So it's higher than what keeps us alive, but lower than our conscious awareness. So you can kind of think of it in those terms. As far as the location, the limbic system is primarily situated deep within the brain and encircling the upper part of the brainstem. And so it's kind of nestled right underneath the cerebral cortex. And this forms a very complex network of interconnected structures. And one of the primary functions of the limbic system is the regulation of emotions. It processes and interprets emotional stimuli, allowing us to experience and express feelings such as joy and fear and anger and sadness. And the limbic system, particularly what's called the hippocampus, it's kind of a seahorse-shaped structure, plays a crucial role in the formation and consolidation of long-term memories. And so it creates the limbic system tied in with this, creates the emotional coloring of our long-term memories and kind of starts to create our sense of the world and our long-term view of the world. Is it a safe place? Is it a happy place? Is it a dangerous place? Is it a scary place? And it helps us to remember emotionally significant events and experiences. So when we remember something from our long-term memory, normally there's an emotional structure to it. Now, there are some key structures within the limbic system, and these include things like the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the cingulate gyrus, and the basal ganglia. And each of these structures contributes to different aspects of emotional processing and behavior. And the limbic system is closely interconnected with other brain regions and allowing it to receive sensory input and to integrate emotional information and send signals to other parts of the brain and body to generate emotional responses. And there's some evolutionary significance to this because the limbic system is considered one of the older parts of the brain from an evolutionary development point of view, and its structures are shared across many vertebrates. And this really kind of highlights its fundamental role in information processing, particularly in emotional processing. Now, I also want to kind of look a little bit at the components of the limbic system. So let's kind of take a little bit of time and look at the basic biological structures that make up the limbic system. Because in understanding these structures and their functions, we have a better grasp of how the limbic system orchestrates our emotional experiences. So let's start off with the hippocampus. So if you could just take a moment and look closely at the hippocampus on this slide. The hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped structure located within the temporal lobes, so just below the temporal lobes in the brain. And it's primarily associated with memory formation as well as spatial navigation. And in the context of emotions, the hippocampus helps to store and retrieve emotional memories. It processes these things and enables us to recall past emotional experiences. Now, there's another part to this, though, and look at the amygdala. The amygdala is just this small almond-shaped structure deep within the brain, and it's attached on the end of the hippocampus. Now, if you find that plays a central role in processing and regulating emotion. So that's basically, it basically tells you when you form a memory, is it a scary memory or is it a safe memory? So it's particularly involved in fear responses and identifying threats. It's kind of this automatic system in our brain that is always looking out for danger automatically. And if it sees danger, then it gives your memory a little bit of a jolt and says, hey, this is something that we need to remember because it's scary. And it helps to evaluate the emotional significance of sensory stimuli. And it triggers the appropriate emotional reactions. So it's important to understand the amygdala, particularly when we come to looking at affective disorders, because there's something else that's kind of goes on here, and that is that the sensitivity of your amygdala can get set early in life based upon a number of factors. So we need to kind of keep that in mind. Now, there's some other structures that are a little bit less important. The hippocampus and the amygdala are the primary ones, but there are some other structures. For example, there's the hypothalamus, which is a crucial structure that's located at the base of your brain. And this really serves as the interface between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it controls various physiological processes like your stress response. So if you're anxious, obviously there's going to be a stress response, but it also manages things like temperature regulation, hunger, thirst, and sexual behavior. So like if you feel that you're in danger, well, you're not going to be too worried about eating something at that moment. So that's part of the reason why the hypothalamus is so important in this context. And it also influences emotional responses through the release of hormones. So it is important in a broad sense for that reason. There's also something known as the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is the relay station in the brain that processes sensory information and routes it to other brain regions, including those in the limbic system. And this plays a role in translating external stimuli into emotional experiences by transmitting sensory data to the amygdala and the limbic system. So when you see something, it doesn't just go to your occipital lobe in the back of your brain. It also goes to a number of other little subconscious areas that potentially can take control if they feel the need to. It's like if there's a danger or a threat. So you need to kind of be mindful of that. Then there's something known as the cingulate gyrus, which is part of kind of a lower area in the cerebral cortex in the top of your head. And it serves as a bridge between the limbic system and your higher cognitive functions. And so it plays a bit of a role in emotional processing. So things like, being able to perspective take, being able to feel what other people feel, feeling empathy, or being able to engage in social interactions and regulating emotional responses to pain and conflict, that sort of thing. There's also something known as the basal ganglia. And now, this isn't traditionally considered part of the limbic system, but the basal ganglia is closely connected to and interacts with the limbic system. And so generally it is involved in kind of the coordination of different things. But in the case of emotions, it kind of influences a little bit your motivation, your rewards, and the regulation of mood and emotional state. So it's a lesser important area, but does play a peripheral role. Now, the thing to kind of keep in mind is there are a lot of specific structures in your brain that have to do with emotions. So understanding the biological components and how they work together within this limbic system to process and regulate emotions, we can really see how complicated it can be to understand the neural circuits that underlie emotional experiences. Now, let's take a little bit of time and just dive a little bit deeper into each of these areas, because I think it's important that we do that. One of these areas is the amygdala. And the amygdala is, if you recall, is that small almond-shaped structure located deep in the brain, specifically in the temporal lobes, just below the temporal lobes, inside. And it's really widely recognized as playing a real central role in processing, regulating emotions, particularly fear and emotional responses. So the amygdala serves really as a hub for the processing of emotional information. So it evaluates the emotional significance of whatever you're experiencing, like facial expressions, it automatically reads those, the tone of voice, it reads that, our different environmental cues and emotional cues as well, social cues, and it assigns emotional value to these things. Now, one of the important roles of the amygdala is in fear and threat detection. It is excellent at looking for potential threats in the environment. When the amygdala perceives a threat, it initiates a very rapid and automatic fear response. So it basically prepares the body to react to danger. It basically triggers your fight and flight response. So sometimes you might notice that you get scared by someone that objectively you know isn't a threat to you. They're kind, but for something about them makes you feel scared. And that is your amygdala not being well educated. And lots of times we need to, in order to be a good, mature person, it takes a long time to retrain your amygdala to understand that these things are, that you don't need to be afraid of certain things. But it's a process that we all live with. Now, the amygdala also plays a crucial role in the formation and storage of emotional memories. So, it helps to encode and consolidate memories associated with emotionally charged events. And an emotionally charged event tells your brain that this is important, this is salient, and that makes it easier to recall. Now, if you experience trauma or something like that, obviously your amygdala then is playing a huge role there, because it is saying that, oh, there's so much emotion here, we need to be able to force it in. And sometimes it does a poor job of that, and then a person experiences what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, which basically means that the memory is so emotionally charged that it gets kind of misfiled or filed in a whole bunch of different places, so that it's constantly there in front of you. And that's a very unpleasant experience. So something to keep in mind as far as the amygdala goes. Now, beyond fear processing, the amygdala is also involved in social and emotional learning. Here, it helps us to recognize and interpret the emotions of others. And so this helps us to feel empathy and to understand social interactions. And it also interacts with other brain regions. So obviously the amygdala doesn't work in isolation. It's constantly communicating with other brain regions, including places like the prefrontal cortex, which helps you plan out things, because if something's dangerous, you want to be able to plan something out, as well as the hippocampus, where if something's dangerous, you want to remember it. So all of these things modulate the emotional responses, and this helps to regulate behavior. Now, when it comes to emotional disorders, if there's dysregulation of the amygdala, that's really associated with various emotional disorders like anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder, as I've already mentioned. So it's important for us to understand the amygdala's role and how crucial it is, so that we can develop treatments. When we understand what the amygdala does, we can then develop logical treatments for these disorders to kind of help to retrain our brain in certain ways. Now, we always want to talk in terms of plasticity, or the ability of the brain to heal or change itself. The brain can do that to some extent. It varies based upon your age and your lifestyle, how flexible that is. But in general, the amygdala demonstrates some degree of plasticity, meaning that it can change and adapt over time. But it is largely set in early childhood, and so it takes a lot of effort to change it after that. And this plasticity allows it, though, to learn and adjust its responses to different emotional stimuli and experiences. And that's why oftentimes psychotherapy works so well, is that we can focus in on retraining things parts of ourselves, like our amygdala, so that it can interact in a more healthy, informed way with the rest of the limbic system and with neurotransmitters to help to modulate some of our emotional experiences. Now, I want to also key in on a really interesting part of the biological component of the limbic system and emotions. It's something known as the raphe nucleus. Now, the raphe nuclei are a group of nuclei located in the brainstem, particularly in the midline of the brainstem's hind portion. And this nuclei are an essential part of the brain's neurotransmitter system. And so it plays a crucial role in regulating mood and emotion and various physiological functions. So there's some key points about the raphe nuclei that I want you to be aware of. First off, it's important in serotonin production. Now, the raphe nuclei is primarily responsible for producing and releasing the neurotransmitter serotonin. And serotonin, you'll come to learn, is a key player in regulating mood as well as emotion and sleep and appetite. It does all sorts of things throughout the body. But because it's so important, it makes this raphe nuclei critical for emotional well-being. And so it's important for modulating emotion, because serotonin that's released from the raphe nuclei influences emotional states and helps to regulate the intensity and duration of emotional responses. So proper serotonin function is associated with a stable and positive mood, while imbalances in serotonin contribute to mood disorders like depression or anxiety. Now, serotonin is not a happy drug. It doesn't make you happy necessarily. What it does is it tells you that things are safe. And that has a cascade effect that helps you to experience the rest of life. So in some laboratories, there's a certain chemical that you can drink that is called the serotonin depletion test. And what it does is it kind of neutralizes all serotonin in your system. So if so someone in a laboratory can experience what it's like to not have serotonin in your system. And basically what ends up happening is all of a sudden you feel a lot of fear and anxiety and panic. Not a pleasant experience, but it's basically tells us that serotonin plays a role in helping us to feel safe. And that then helps it to connect all of our systems with each other within the limbic system. So the raphe nuclei obviously is then interconnected with things like our amygdala and our prefrontal cortex, because it contributes to this modulation of emotional processing within the limbic system. It also has something to do with the sleep-wake cycle, because serotonin is such an important part of this system. And then, of course, medications that treat mood disorders, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, target the serotonin system by increasing serotonin levels in the brain. And these medications often have a positive impact on mood and emotional stability. Now, of course, there's a lot of individual variability in the functioning of the raphe nuclei. And that, of course, is going to play a role in a person's emotional resilience and susceptibility to mood disorders. So there's a genetic factor, there's environmental factors. All of these things play into this. But the thing that I want to leave you with is that there is a specific role for the raphe nuclei, and their regulation of serotonin production is really essential for us understanding the biological basis of emotions. Now, let's take a little bit of time and actually talk a little bit about the neurotransmitters. And there are some basic ones that are fairly important within the limbic system. So now there are many, many different hormones and neurotransmitters within the brain, but as far as emotions and your affect and the limbic system, there are some key ones that we need to kind of be mindful of. Now, first off, let's remember what neurotransmitters are and what they do. So neurons are the basic building blocks of your nervous system, and neurons communicate with each other by releasing neurotransmitters across synapses, that little gap between them, and which are the junctions between the nerve cells. And these neurotransmitters bind to receptors on neighboring neurons transmitting signals. Now, while there are many neurotransmitters in the brain, several are particularly relevant to emotions. These include serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and gamma aminobutyric acid, something we call GABA. It's kind of the short term for that. Now, I just want to kind of take a little bit of time and walk through each of those so you have a better sense of them. Now, what serotonin essentially does is it's associated with regulating mood, and regulating anxiety tells you that you feel safe. So it gives you a sense of overall emotional well-being. So if there is an imbalance in serotonin levels, that tends to be linked to mood disorders like depression and anxiety, because you don't feel safe. When you don't feel safe, you can't really engage in anything because you're trying to protect yourself automatically. So you don't want to engage, so you're not going to feel happy, so you're going to feel sad. Then there's dopamine. Dopamine is often referred to as the feel-good neurotransmitter, but it's not quite that powerful. Although it's very important, it plays a role in reward and pleasure and motivation and reinforcement. Basically, it tells you what you like. When you like something, you are getting a hit of dopamine. And so if you have dysregulation of dopamine, that becomes implicated in addiction. Addiction is basically your brain telling you that you want more dopamine by doing this substance. But if you have too much dopamine, that can also create serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia. So dopamine needs to be in a important balance as well. Balance is really important, you'll see in neurotransmitters. Then there's norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is involved in the body's stress response and emotional arousal. So it contributes to heightened alertness and vigilance during emotionally charged situations. And then there's gamma aminobutyric acid, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when you want to really chill out and feel calm and not worry about things and be able to relax your muscles a lot, that's GABA. And what it does is it counters the effects of the excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate. So it promotes calmness and relaxation. So when you're calm and relaxed, that means your GABA is doing good. So, in essence, what we want to do to have good emotional health is to balance our neurotransmitters. That's really crucial for emotional stability. Now, imbalances, whether they're due to genetic factors or trauma or other causes, they can lead to emotional disorders and emotional dysregulation. So we try to develop medications and therapies to target specific neurotransmitters. So, for example, antidepressants are often used to focus in on managing serotonin. You can have medications for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that will tend to affect things like the dopamine levels. Now, of course, in our everyday life, there are substances that impact our neurotransmitters. Things like alcohol profoundly tends to mimic GABA. Caffeine tends to give you a bit of a hit of dopamine. Recreational drugs can not only impact neurotransmitters levels, they can sometimes mimic the function of them in our brain. And so consequently, this has an impact upon our emotional states. And what this can do is lead to short-term mood alterations, but in some cases it can lead to long-term emotional problems or behavioral issues like addiction. Now, I want to take just a little bit more time, and because serotonin is so important, and while we've talked about it, I want to kind of just narrow in a little bit more with serotonin and what serotonin does. So remember, I said that serotonin is referred to as the feel-good neurotransmitter because it plays a central role in regulating mood. So when you have adequate serotonin levels, you tend to feel happy and emotionally stable. So emotional well-being really does depend upon proper serotonin function, because this contributes to positive emotional state. It doesn't give you joy. What it does instead, though, is sets the pretext for joy to happen. So when you start to feel safe, then when you experience things, joy will come. It gives you the pretext for contentment. It's not contentment in a pill, but it helps your brain to be ready to receive contentment. So imbalances in serotonin are key components of depression and anxiety. And so that's part of what we need to kind of keep in mind here. And remember, serotonin is produced by the raphe nuclei of the brainstem, but it is ubiquitous within our body, does all sorts of things throughout our body. In fact, you have more serotonin in your lower intestines than you do oftentimes in your brain, because it does so much. It plays a role in your blood and what your blood does. So it does lots of things, but it travels through the brain via specific pathways, and so it has connections with all different parts of the limbic system, including your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. And all of these things are really essentially tied to, is there danger, or do I feel safe? So when you have lots of serotonin in your system and it's working well within all these parts of your brain and your body, you feel safe. You don't feel like the world is a dangerous threat. But when there's an imbalance, you feel like the world is a dangerous, scary place. Low serotonin levels lead to heightened anxiety and excessive worry. And so serotonin is involved in also regulating social behaviors like feeling empathy and cooperation with others. So like if you have too much serotonin, then you almost don't worry about other people and have a hard time reading other people. But if you don't have enough, then you are sometimes very hypersensitive to what other people are doing. So you need to kind of find that balance in there. You also need to kind of remember that diet and lifestyle impact serotonin levels. So foods rich in things like tryptophan, which is an amino acid precursor to serotonin, helps to promote serotonin production. Now, but it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but it's there. Also, exercise is important. Exposure to natural light can also positively impact serotonin levels. So there's a lot of things, including genetic factors, that influence how effectively serotonin is produced, released, and then broken down within the brain, because breaking down serotonin is another key component. And that's actually what a lot of the medications do, is they don't give you serotonin. You can't take a serotonin pill because there's something called a blood-brain barrier. But what can happen is we can block serotonin being broken down within the brain, and that in turn leads to, over a period of time, levels of serotonin building up to a point where you start to feel safe and then happy. Now, I want to take a look a little bit at the biology of fear and anxiety, because that's a really complicated thing that plays an important role in our understanding of affective disorders. And fear and anxiety are really two key emotions that are really intricately linked and really have profound implications for our mental and emotional well-being. So let's kind of dive into some of the brain structures here. So first off, let's take a look at the amygdala's role. And the amygdala, remember, is a key component of the limbic system. It plays a central role in the processing of fear and anxiety, and it acts as an emotional alarm system. It's that thing that's looking for danger. And when it detects potential threats in the environment, it sets off the alarm. So when the amygdala perceives a threat, it initiates a rapid and an automatic fear response. And it depends upon how sensitive this is, where that threshold is for that fear alarm. And that's something that is learned, and our brains kind of, and it's based somewhat on genetics and other factors, but basically what ends up happening is when this alarm system goes off, we experience increased heart rate, heightened alertness, and our body releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which prepares our body to respond to danger. Now, that might keep us alive, but if you are in like a stressful work environment, cortisol is and adrenaline is supposed to be short-term, immediate things. When they are constantly occurring, it can really wear you out quickly. In fact, there's lots of studies that show that cortisol and adrenaline, when they're continually being released in stressful environments, it really literally ages you. So anxiety can be seen really as a generalized form of fear. So while fear is often a response to a very specific, immediate threat, anxiety involves a more prolonged and more diffuse sense of apprehension and worry about potential fear threats. So that's a good way to kind of understand anxiety. And of course, there's going to be some neurotransmitters that play a role in anxiety. So if there's an imbalance in neurotransmitters, particularly two, serotonin that tells you to feel safe, and GABA, which tells you to relax, those two are linked highly with anxiety disorder. So when you have low levels of serotonin, that's associated with increased anxiety, and GABA acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which can calm the nervous system. So if you have low levels of GABA, you're going to feel intense and stressed as well. Then there is the prefrontal cortex regulation, okay? That part of your higher order brain that tells you that you need to start planning things out and thinking certain ways. That plays a role in regulating and moderating the fear and anxiety responses. So you start to think about all the threats that are going on in your life. And it helps individuals evaluate the actual threat level of a situation and engage in rational decision making. Now, if you do not take control of that part, then you just kind of ruminate on all the emotional problems or the danger in the world, then you are really kind of buying into this whole out of control system. And so oftentimes what you can do with fear and anxiety disorders is to help a person train them to think differently, and that can start to break some of this cycle. There's also the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, what we call the HPA axis, which is a complex neuroendocrine system that plays a central role in the body's automatic stress response. And when there's dysregulation of the HPA axis, that can also be associated with chronic stress and anxiety. Of course, there's neuroplasticity and fear learning, because the brain has a remarkable capacity for changing how it functions and to adapt and to learn from experiences. So in the context of fear and anxiety, this can lead to the development of things like phobias or the perpetuation of anxiety disorders. You need to kind of be mindful of that as well. Now, the important thing is when you understand the biological basis of anxiety and fear and how this leads to these experiences, then we can start to develop various therapeutic approaches for helping, like exposure therapy, which can start to retrain some of these areas, like cognitive behavioral therapy that disrupts that cycle by changing the way you think, and then that will slowly change the way the whole system works, or by medications that target neurotransmitter imbalances that can start to change how this whole system works. And the biology of anxiety and fear, I hope you see there that it's really important, but we need to remember that not everybody is the same. We all have different genetic factors, we have different life experiences, we have different environmental influences, and so it takes some time and some real insight in order to be able to understand what is going on with a client. Now, I want to explore another area in life that kind of has to do with this, but you can think about things like shame, disgust, sadness. So sometimes when people are depressed, they also feel a lot of self-loathing, they feel very ashamed, they feel disgusted with themselves. There's other situations, like in hoarding situations, where a person feels disgust by getting rid of something. They need to hold on to something, whereas the average person would be disgusted by all of the hoarding. All of this has to do with a part of the brain known as the anterior cingulate cortex. It has to do with shame, disgust, and so on. So basically, if the corners of your mouth turn down, so think when you're disgusted about something, what does your mouth do? The corners of your mouth turn down. Or when you feel shame, the corners of your mouth turn down. That is a sign that your anterior cingulate cortex is being activated. And shame and disgust are distinct, but they're closely related emotions. Shame typically arises from a sense of self-evaluation and often involves feelings of embarrassment, of feeling unworthy or inferior. Disgust, on the other hand, is a strong aversion to something considered repulsive or offensive. So the anterior cingulate cortex is that region of the brain below the frontal and parietal lobes that wraps around the head of the corpus callosum. And it plays a crucial role in processing emotional experiences, particularly related to social and moral emotions like shame and disgust. So a lot of research into the anterior cingulate cortex suggests that it is involved in this experience of shame and helps a person to evaluate their own behavior and actions in social contexts. So you can be doing something that's bad and you feel fine about it until you see someone looking at you, and all of a sudden you feel shame and disgust at what you are doing. That is the role of the anterior cingulate cortex. And so it processes disgust. It keeps us safe from unpleasant odors, from dangerous images. That is the kind of thing that the anterior cingulate cortex does. But it also helps us to manage our moral decision making and our social behavior. So I just want you to kind of be aware of shame and disgust and how the anterior cingulate cortex works. And that will help you then to understand things like social anxiety. When you feel like you're not worthy and you're afraid to be out in public, or when you don't want to get rid of things because you can't imagine how disgusting would it be to get rid of something, and so you need to keep things and you fill up your room with stuff, or obsessive compulsive disorder, or certain eating disorders where shame and disgust play a significant role. All of these things have a lot of their neural basis in their connections with the anterior cingulate cortex. And that will then help us to understand these disorders and be able to treat them a little bit better. I also want to take a little bit of time now and just look at anxiety disorders in general, because the characteristic features of this group of disorders are symptoms of anxiety and avoidance behavior. So to one degree or another, we all experience some of these symptoms. And it's when these symptoms become disabling that a person suffers from them, and we can then say that they are experiencing a disorder. So anxiety is normal. It's important. Disgust is normal. Shame is normal. These are things that we need to be dealing with. But when they start to become overwhelmingly persistent and impact our everyday life and circumstances, that is where it becomes a problem and can lead to, special things like panic disorder or agoraphobia or something. So we'll just kind of start off a little bit with generalized anxiety. And generalized anxiety is someone who experiences anxiety and excessive worry most of the time. The anxiety is not with any single life circumstance or situation. It's really an unrealistic and excessive obsession with the reality of a person's life. So the DSM really requires that the anxiety be present for, say, 6 months or more, for more days than not, before it can be diagnosed. In other words, people with this disorder live with a relatively constant state of diffuse and unfocused anxiety, this apprehension and dread, what Freud called free-floating anxiety. And so this disorder is something much more severe than the common brief periods of mild anxiety that we all experience. So we can think in terms of twitching and trembling and muscle aches and restlessness and autonomic hyperactivity, shortness of breath, accelerated heart rate, sweating, dry mouth, dizziness, nausea, chills, vigilance and scanning. So you're keyed up, you're easily startled, you have difficulty concentrating, you have insomnia and irritability. Now, apparently, this is not a very commonly diagnosed disorder. Okay, I guess that's all relative, but part of it is that has historically been some confusion as to whether we should categorize it as generalized anxiety, or if it's better categorized in other areas. But in general, I hope that you see that this is a fairly unpleasant experience. But there are more specific types of affective disorders. One of those is what we call agoraphobia, or what we just call phobias now, but historically it's been called agoraphobia, which basically literally means fear of the marketplace, or fear of being in places or situations where you just can't escape, or it might be difficult to get out of there. So agoraphobia is not the fear of open spaces so much as the fear of fear. We're afraid that we're going to get afraid and that we won't be able to get away. That's really what we're looking at. And then we can kind of see, historically in the DSM, we kind of divide up these areas into a couple of areas. There's panic, where you're afraid that you're going to have a panic attack. And there's a panic disorder with agoraphobia and panic disorder without agoraphobia. Now, there are lots of different phobias, and historically, we've used Greek prefixes to describe these phobias, but as we've revised the DSM, we've kind of changed that a little bit to use more common language. So we used to have things like xenophobia, which was the fear of foreigners, or claustrophobia, which is the fear of closed spaces, or acrophobia, which is the fear of heights. But we found that it was getting pretty jargony, and people were not being, like it used to be, people would be part of your traditional education when you would study some Greek and some Latin. We don't do that anymore. So that's part of the reason why we've kind of changed things now to something like a simple phobia or a social phobia. But the thing is that these are fears that lead to significant and irrational responses, emotional responses. And that is part of what we need to be mindful of. So, for example, social phobias are characterized by persistent fear of one or more social situations, where one might be exposed to scrutiny and attention of others. So like stage fright, or fear of public speaking, or generalized fear of social situations. A fear of asserting yourself, fear of criticism, fear of making a mistake, fear of public speaking. Now, all of these things are normal. These are situations that aren't really dangerous. I mean, we shouldn't really be afraid of criticism, or of making a mistake, and in our general everyday life. But oftentimes it's something that really kind of overwhelms someone. Now, there are specific treatments for this. One is systematic desensitization, where we're basically retraining the system to recognize things not as a danger, but as something that is safe. So that would be an example of that. Another thing I want to just kind of close our lecture with is a little bit of the biology of happiness. We've talked about the limbic system in terms of the problems that it can cause, but we haven't talked about happiness. And I want to kind of just talk a little bit about that, because neurotransmitters and happiness really do go together. There are several neurotransmitters that play a crucial role in regulating happiness. These primarily are serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. Endorphins are those things that we get from doing something. But there's also serotonin and dopamine, and these together we can think of as the feel-good neurotransmitters. Now, dopamine in particularly is strongly associated with experiencing pleasure and reward. So it's released in response to enjoyable experiences. So here's the thing, you need to have the experience. And then this reinforces the behavior that leads to happiness. And when you have dopamine without the experience, endorphins. That is a drug, and we don't want to be doing that because dopamine has a specific role in our lives. And there's something called the ventral striatum, which is part of the brain's reward system that's really central to the experience of happiness. And it becomes activated when we encounter pleasurable stimuli like food or social interactions or rewarding experiences. And there's also the prefrontal cortex and cognitive aspects. So the prefrontal cortex, specifically this what's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is involved in the cognitive aspects of happiness. So it helps us to evaluate our own well-being. It says, yeah, this is good, this is healthy. It helps us to make judgments about what brings us happiness and anticipate future happiness. Then we have endorphins and pain relief. So endorphins are neurotransmitters that basically act like natural painkillers and mood elevators. They take away not only your physical pain, but your emotional pain. And these are released during activities like exercise, like laughter. And actually, here's a little bit of a secret, eating spicy foods can actually help increase your endorphins as well. And this helps to contribute to feelings of happiness. So, and then there's social and emotional components. So happiness is not solely a product of individual brain activity, but is deeply influenced by social interactions, particularly safe social interactions and emotional connections. So positive relationships and social support are essential for sustaining happiness. Hope you can appreciate that. So here's just a few key terms I want to kind of leave you with as we close out our lecture. The first one is the limbic system. Remember, this is that collection of brain structures that are involved in regulating emotion and memory and other emotional processes. And remember, limbus means the border or the edge. So this is kind of that border region between your brainstem and your higher order functioning. That's where the limbic system is. Then there's neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit signals between neurons in the brain. And one of the most important of these is serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter associated with mood regulation, helping you feel safe and emotional well-being. Then there's the amygdala. That's that almond-shaped brain structure that's really crucial for processing and regulating emotions, particularly fear. So it gives emotional color to our memories. The raphe nuclei, that's that brainstem nuclei that's responsible for producing serotonin and also regulating emotional states. Remember our anterior cingulate cortex, that's the region, okay, right below your cortex and above your corpus callosum, that is involved in processing social and moral emotions like shame and disgust. Happiness. Phobias. Phobias, we know what a phobia is. That's a fear of something, an irrational fear of something. Okay, and then we have the question, what is the primary role of the amygdala in the brain's emotional processing? Well, what does it do? It processes and regulates emotions, particularly fear. Hope you enjoyed this lecture where we explored biological mechanisms of fear and anxiety, and I hope it gave you a better sense of what makes up our emotional experiences and what is going on behind the scenes with affective disorders. You take care. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.